What would you do if everything you built for God, everything you consecrated, everything you called holy, was reduced to ash and silence in a single night? Pause. Let that question breathe. Let it sit in the room like smoke. Because that is not a hypothetical question. That is history. That is a moment that actually happened, on a real night, in a real city, with real people watching real flames consume the most sacred building the ancient world had ever known. The screams were real. The smoke was real. The silence that followed, that devastating, hollow, "God, where are you?" silence, was real. We live in a world that builds things. We build institutions, we build legacies, we build communities of faith, we build lives carefully arranged around what we believe to be true and good and permanent. And most of us carry somewhere deep in our chest the quiet, unspoken assumption that if we build it for the right reasons, if we consecrate it to the right cause, if we dedicate it to God, then surely it will last. Surely it will be protected. Surely nothing can touch it. Jerusalem thought the same thing, and on a burning evening in 586 BC, with soldiers at the gates and flames climbing toward heaven, that assumption was shattered completely, and the story that came out of those ashes has been speaking to the human soul ever since. This is that story. And if you are willing to sit with its fire long enough, it will change the way you see everything you are holding on to today. Solomon's temple, known historically as the First Temple, was constructed around 957 BC under the reign of King Solomon, the son of David, and it represented far more than an architectural achievement. It was the physical embodiment of a covenant between God and his chosen people, a structure so magnificent and so intentional in every detail that it stood as the defining symbol of Jewish identity, worship, and national purpose for nearly 4 centuries. The idea of building a permanent house for God had actually originated with King David, Solomon's father, who desired deeply to replace the portable tabernacle that Israel had carried through the wilderness with something permanent and worthy of divine presence. However, God told David that because he was a man of war, it would be his son who would build the temple. Solomon inherited both the vision and the enormous resources David had spent a lifetime collecting for that very purpose. The construction effort was staggering by any ancient standard. Solomon conscripted tens of thousands of laborers, including 30,000 men sent in rotating shifts to Lebanon alone just to harvest cedar wood. The cedars of Lebanon were considered the finest timber in the known world, prized for their strength, fragrance, and beauty. Thousands of stonecutters worked in the quarries shaping massive foundation blocks. Skilled Phoenician craftsmen were brought in from Tyre to work the bronze and gold, because Solomon understood that a house for God deserved the finest artisans alive. The temple took 7 full years to complete, and when it was finished, it was overlaid extensively with pure gold. The inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, was entirely covered in gold. The floors were gold. The walls were gold. Even the hinges of the doors were gold. Inside this innermost chamber rested the Ark of the Covenant, flanked by 2 enormous cherubim carved from olive wood, each standing 15 feet tall with wings outstretched, their wingtips touching wall to wall in the darkness of that sacred space. The temple was not merely a religious site. It was the center of the entire national life of Israel. Every major festival, every sacrifice, every act of communal worship revolved around it. The priesthood existed to serve it. The economy of Jerusalem was shaped around it. Pilgrims traveled from every corner of the land to worship there. When Solomon dedicated the temple, the Bible records that the glory of God filled the building as a cloud so thick that the priests could not even stand to perform their duties. That dedication moment was understood as God literally taking up residence among his people. For a people whose entire identity was built on their relationship with God, there was no more powerful or sacred space on the face of the earth. The destruction of Solomon's temple did not occur in a vacuum, and it cannot be understood without grasping the deeply complicated and ultimately fatal political decisions made by the kings of Judah in the final decades before 586 BC. The Babylonian Empire under its rulers had become the dominant superpower of the ancient Near East, having defeated the Assyrian Empire and crushed Egyptian ambitions at the decisive Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC. After that battle, the small kingdoms and city-states of the Levant, including Judah, had essentially no realistic choice but to acknowledge Babylonian supremacy. King Jehoiakim of Judah initially submitted, becoming a vassal and paying tribute. For a small kingdom surrounded by powerful forces, this was the only path to survival. However, the political calculations of Judah's leadership were consistently poor, driven by pride, short-sightedness, and a dangerous misreading of both international power dynamics and prophetic warnings. When Egypt showed signs of renewed strength, Jehoiakim made the catastrophic decision to switch his loyalty and rebel against Babylon. This was not simply a political miscalculation. It was an act of open defiance against the most militarily powerful empire in the world. The prophet Jeremiah had been warning repeatedly and passionately against exactly this kind of rebellion, arguing that submission to Babylon was actually God's disciplinary will for the nation at that time. Jeremiah was ignored, mocked, imprisoned, and accused of being a traitor for delivering that message. The political leaders of Judah preferred the counsel of prophets who told them what they wanted to hear, that God would protect Jerusalem no matter what. The pattern repeated itself tragically. After the first siege and the appointment of Zedekiah as a puppet king, Babylon expected loyalty. Instead, Zedekiah eventually entered into negotiations with Egypt and rebelled again. This second rebellion sealed Jerusalem's fate entirely. When Nebuchadnezzar returned with his armies for the final siege, there was no mercy left, no diplomatic solution available, and no Egyptian rescue coming. Egypt attempted a military intervention but withdrew when the Babylonian army turned to meet them. Jerusalem was left completely alone. The political leaders had gambled everything on alliances that collapsed and on a theology of invincibility that the prophets had never actually promised. Every act of rebellion simply raised the intensity of Babylon's eventual response, turning what might have been ongoing subjugation into total annihilation. One of the most important and often overlooked aspects of Babylon's destruction of Jerusalem and its temple is that the process was not a single catastrophic event, but rather a deliberate, methodical campaign conducted across multiple military engagements spanning nearly 2 decades. Understanding this staged approach reveals the calculated nature of Babylonian imperial strategy and shows how the wealth of Solomon's temple was drained away progressively, each wave of looting leaving the city weaker, poorer, and more vulnerable to the next assault. The first encounter came in approximately 605 BC, when Babylon established dominance over Judah following the defeat of Egypt at Carchemish. At this stage, Babylon was not yet focused on total destruction. It wanted submission, tribute, and useful human capital. The initial taking involved hostages from the nobility, young men of intelligence and potential who would be educated and assimilated into Babylonian court culture, and also included some of the vessels and treasures from the temple. These objects were taken to Babylon and placed in the treasury of the Babylonian god, a deliberate symbolic act communicating that the god of Judah had been subordinated to the gods of Babylon. This first wave was a statement of dominance, not annihilation. The second, more severe stripping came in 597 BC after Judah's first open rebellion. This time, Babylon was less patient. King Jehoiakim was captured and taken to Babylon along with a massive deportation. Approximately 10,000 people, including soldiers, craftsmen, priests, and the educated elite of the society. The temple and the royal palace were both ransacked far more thoroughly at this stage. Significant quantities of gold and sacred vessels were removed and transported to Babylon. This deportation was strategically brutal. By taking the skilled and educated population, Babylon was deliberately weakening Judah's ability to organize, administer, and resist in the future. The temple still stood physically after this second wave, but it had been significantly stripped of its treasures, its priestly leadership decimated, and its surrounding society hollowed out. The third and final wave in 586 BC was total destruction. By this point, whatever treasures remained after the previous lootings were seized completely, the sacred objects were systematically catalogued and removed, and the building itself was burned to the ground. The cumulative impact of all three stages meant that the temple's wealth was exhausted incrementally, making the final destruction both militarily inevitable and spiritually devastating. To fully grasp the magnitude of what was lost when the temple's sacred objects were seized and destroyed, one must move beyond thinking of them as merely valuable antiques or impressive metalwork, and understand them within their proper theological and symbolic framework. Every single object in Solomon's temple had been designed, positioned, and consecrated with specific spiritual meaning. They were not decorations. They were not simply displays of royal wealth. They were physical expressions of theological realities, each one communicating something profound about the nature of God, the nature of worship, and the covenant relationship between God and Israel. The two great bronze pillars at the entrance, named Jachin and Boaz, were among the first things the Babylonians destroyed and hauled away as scrap metal. Their names carried meaning, Jachin meaning "he establishes," and Boaz meaning "in him is strength." Every Israelite who passed between those pillars on their way to worship was walking through a declaration of faith. They stood roughly 27 feet tall, topped with elaborate capitals decorated with pomegranates and lily designs. They were not structural pillars. They held nothing up architecturally. Their purpose was entirely symbolic, marking the threshold between the ordinary world and the sacred space of God's presence. When those pillars were smashed and carried off as bronze metal to be melted down or repurposed, it was not just architectural vandalism. It was the deliberate erasure of a theological statement. The bronze sea was equally weighted with meaning. This enormous basin, holding thousands of gallons of water, rested on the backs of 12 bronze oxen arranged in groups of 3 facing the 4 compass directions. The priests used it for ritual purification before performing their sacred duties. Water in ancient Near Eastern symbolism represented life, purification, and divine blessing. The 12 oxen represented the 12 tribes of Israel. The act of the priests washing before approaching God was not merely hygienic. It was a liturgical enactment of the truth that approaching a holy God requires a cleansed and consecrated humanity. When Babylon smashed that sea into pieces for the metal, they were dismantling not just an object, but an entire theology of holiness expressed in bronze. The golden lampstands, the incense altars, the showbread table, each carried layers of meaning that made their removal a theological assault as much as a military one. For the surrounding nations watching, the message was unmistakable. Babylon's gods had defeated Israel's God. For the people of Israel, devastated and confused in exile, it raised agonizing questions about God's power, God's faithfulness, and whether the covenant itself had been broken. The symbolic weight of those stolen objects was so enormous that the Jewish people mourned them for generations. Of all the extraordinary and heartbreaking dimensions of the temple's destruction, none captures the imagination more completely or raises more profound historical and theological questions than the complete and total disappearance of the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark was not simply the most valuable object in the temple, it was the most sacred object in the entire world as far as the Jewish faith was concerned. It was the golden chest that had been constructed in the wilderness under Moses, built precisely according to God's own specifications, designed to house the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments, Aaron's rod, and a jar of manna from the desert wandering. Its lid, called the mercy seat, was flanked by 2 golden cherubim, and it was understood to be the place where the very presence of God rested on earth, the footstool of the divine throne. The Ark had a history that inspired both wonder and terror. It had parted the Jordan River. It had brought the walls of Jericho down. It had struck men dead for touching it without authorization. When David brought it to Jerusalem, he danced before it with abandon. When Solomon installed it in the Holy of Holies, the cloud of God's glory was so overwhelming that the priests could not stand. The Ark was not a religious symbol in the modern sentimental sense. It was treated as a living, powerful, holy, and dangerous reality, the physical locus of divine presence among humanity. And then, sometime around 586 BC, it simply vanishes from the historical record entirely. What makes the mystery so extraordinary is the nature of the silence itself. Every other significant object removed from the temple is catalogued. The Bible gives detailed inventories of the bronze pillars, the golden vessels, the bronze sea, the lampstands, all of it carefully listed as taken to Babylon. But the ark is not on any list. It is not mentioned as captured. It is not mentioned as destroyed. It is not mentioned as hidden. It simply disappears, and the biblical record moves on without explanation. Theories have multiplied across centuries and continue to fascinate historians, archaeologists, theologians, and explorers to this day. One of the most enduring traditions holds that the ark was taken to Ethiopia, carried there by Menelik, the son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, and that it resides to this day in a small chapel in Axum, guarded by a single monk who devotes his entire life to its protection and is never permitted to leave. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintains this claim with complete seriousness. Another tradition holds that the prophet Jeremiah, knowing the Babylonians were coming, hid the ark in a cave on Mount Nebo, the mountain from which Moses had viewed the promised land before his death. Some Jewish traditions hold that it was hidden beneath the Temple Mount itself, sealed in a tunnel or chamber directly below the Holy of Holies, where it waits to be revealed in the Messianic age. The fact that no archaeological excavation of the Temple Mount has ever been permitted by the authorities controlling the site means this theory cannot be tested. What is certain is that the Ark never appears again in any verified historical record, making its fate one of the most tantalizing and enduring mysteries in all of human history. The Babylonian Exile, which began with the deportations accompanying the temple's destruction and lasted for roughly 50 years until the Persian king Cyrus issued his famous decree in 539 BC, was not merely a period of national humiliation and suffering for the Jewish people. It was, paradoxically and profoundly, one of the most transformative and creatively fertile periods in the entire history of the Jewish faith. What began as a catastrophe ended as a crucible, and the people who emerged from Babylon were in many ways spiritually deeper, intellectually more sophisticated, and theologically more mature than the people who had gone in. The immediate psychological and spiritual crisis of the exile was immense. An entire worldview had been shattered. The temple was gone, the place where God lived, where sacrifice was offered, where atonement was made, where festivals were celebrated. The Davidic monarchy was gone. The land of Israel, which the covenant had promised as an everlasting inheritance, had been taken away. For a people whose theology was deeply tied to land, temple, and dynasty, every theological anchor had been simultaneously pulled up. The questions the exiles wrestled with were not abstract philosophical puzzles. They were existential, agonizing, and urgent. Had God abandoned them? Had God been defeated? Was the covenant broken? Was there any reason to maintain Jewish identity in a foreign land surrounded by powerful, sophisticated, and attractive Babylonian culture? It was precisely in wrestling with those questions that some of the most profound theological developments in all of Scripture took place. The exile appears to have been a period of intense literary and editorial activity. Scholars believe that many of the great texts of the Hebrew Bible were compiled, edited, and given their final form during and immediately after the Babylonian period, as the scribes and priests worked urgently to preserve, transmit, and make sense of everything that had happened. The prophetic writings of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the later chapters of Isaiah were either produced in or shaped by the exilic experience, and they contain some of the most searching, beautiful, and theologically rich material in all of Scripture. Perhaps most significantly, the exile gave birth to the synagogue as an institution. Without a temple, without sacrifices, without the elaborate priestly rituals that had defined worship for centuries, the Jewish community in Babylon had to discover a new way of maintaining their identity and their relationship with God. They gathered in homes and community spaces to read Scripture together, to pray, to teach, and to remember. That practice became the synagogue, a revolutionary religious institution that required no temple, no priesthood, no sacrifice, and no specific geography. It could exist anywhere in the world where 10 Jewish adults gathered. This innovation, born of necessity in the ashes of catastrophe, ultimately gave Judaism the resilience, and adaptability that allowed it to survive not just the Babylonian exile, but every subsequent dispersion across 2,500 years of history. The exile did not destroy the Jewish faith. It transformed and in many ways strengthened it beyond anything the pre-exilic world could have imagined.